Search Freudian films and you'll get the same names. But the films that are truly Freudian, the ones built from the inside out with his ideas, never made those lists. They're too strange, too unsettling. Here are 7. Let's begin. Repulsion, Roman Polanski, 1965. Carol Ledoux is beautiful, quiet, and completely unreachable. She works as a manicurist in London. She flinches when men come near her. She wipes her mouth after a boyfriend kisses her. The title is literal by the very idea of sex. Then her sister leaves for a holiday, and Carol is alone. What follows is one of the most precise dramatizations of Freudian psychosexual repression ever filmed, not because Polanski explains it, he never does, but because he builds it, image by image, into the architecture of the film itself. Freud's theory of psychosexual development argues that libido, sexual energy, doesn't disappear when it's suppressed. It transforms. It finds another channel. And when that channel is blocked completely, it turns inward and becomes pathology. Carol's apartment is her psyche made visible. At the beginning, it's ordered and clean. As her repression collapses, the walls crack. Hands reach out of them to grab her. Rooms expand into vast, threatening darkness. The familiar becomes monstrous. The phallic symbolism is relentless and deliberate. Her sister's boyfriend leaves his razor on the bathroom sink. She cannot touch it, cannot look at it. A postcard arrives from Italy, a photograph of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. She hallucinates rape. She kills with a candlestick. She kills with the razor. And the film ends on a childhood photograph. Carol, as a young girl, standing slightly apart from her family, not looking at the camera, looking with an expression that is not quite fear and not quite longing, at her father. No explanation, just a photograph. Just a look that has no name, and has had no name for Carol's entire life. Dead Ringers, David Cronenberg, 1988. Beverly and Elliot Mantle are identical twin gynecologists. They share an apartment, a career, a bed, and the women they sleep with, one impersonating the other interchangeably for years. From the outside, they are two people. From the inside, they have never learned to be. Freud's concept of the Unheimliche, the uncanny, describes the feeling of encountering something simultaneously familiar and deeply wrong. The identical twin is perhaps its purest embodiment, a face that is your face, a body that is your body, existing separately, looking back at you. Freud identified the double as one of the most reliable sources of uncanny dread precisely because it forces a question the ego cannot answer. Where do I end and the other begin? Academic film scholar Barbara Creed, in her landmark 1990 essay on the film, identifies their pathology as a form of phallic panic, a male hysteria rooted in womb envy. Their entire careers as gynecologists are, in Freudian terms, a compulsive attempt to master the origin they cannot escape. They study, probe, and instrument the womb, the very site from which they emerged as two instead of one. Their obsession with women, Beverly begins calling his patients mutant women, those with anatomical abnormalities, is the clinical surface of a much deeper dread, that their own origin was monstrous, that being twins means being wrong from the start. When Beverly falls in love with an actress named Claire, the ego boundary the twins have never developed begins to crack. Beverly wants a self, a separate life, but individuation, for someone who has never been truly separate, feels like annihilation. Freud wrote that the ego forms through differentiation, through the slow recognition that the self ends where the other begins. The Mantle twins never completed that process, and when Beverly tries to complete it now, the psychic cost destroys them both. Cronenberg films their dissolution in the language of the body, instruments designed to operate on mutant women, drug dependency, physical decay. By the end, they are found together on the floor of their apartment. Two bodies, one ego, and neither survived the separation. Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence. Nagisa Oshima, 1983. Java, 1942. A Japanese prisoner of war camp, and a camp commander named Yonoi who cannot stop watching one of his prisoners. The prisoner is Major Jack Selliers, played by David Bowie. Yonoi watches him during roll call, visits his cell at night in silence. He is the camp's supreme authority. Selliers is his enemy, and Yonoi is falling apart. Freud's concept of repression goes deeper than hiding feelings. The psychic cost of that hiding, the energy required to keep something buried, accumulates. And repression doesn't neutralize desire, it pressurizes it. When that pressure has nowhere to release, it turns into aggression, into cruelty, into acts that destroy both the person repressing and the person they cannot stop thinking about. Yonoi's attraction to Selliers is inseparable from his need to punish him. Every act of brutality is also an act of desperate containment. But there is something else Freud understood about repression. The repressed retains its power only as long as it stays hidden. The moment it is named, exposed, the power collapses. Selliers understands this. In the film's pivotal scene, as Yonoi is about to execute a prisoner, Selliers steps forward and kisses him on the cheek. In front of everyone, Yonoi collapses. It is a weapon, not a gesture. By making the unspoken visible, Selliers destroys the entire structure Yonoi has built around it. The repression was the power, and now it's gone. Selliers is buried alive for it, neck deep in sand, left to die slowly under the Java sun. Freud argued that repressed eros, love, desire, the life drive, inverts. It becomes its own opposite, the drive toward destruction, toward death. Oshima just put that on screen. Innocence, Lucille Hadzihalilovic, 2004. The film begins with a coffin, a small wooden box carried through a forest, set down in a clearing. The lid opens. A little girl climbs out, blinking. She has arrived at a school, a walled, all-female boarding school deep in the woods, with no visible entrance and no visible exit. The girls wear white dresses, in their hair, colored ribbons, red for the youngest, violet for the oldest. As the girls age, the ribbon changes. When the ribbon changes for the last time, they leave. Where they go, no one explains. Freud divided childhood development into stages: oral, anal, phallic, latency, genital, each with its own psychic territory, its own anxieties, its own relationship to the body, and desire. The latency stage, which runs roughly from age 6 to puberty, is the period in which sexuality goes underground. The drives do not disappear. They are repressed and redirected into learning, into socialization, into the acquisition of culture. The child learns to be civilized precisely because desire has nowhere else to go. Hadzihalilovich's school is the latency stage made architectural. The wall around it is the boundary of that developmental period, impermeable, total, existing outside ordinary time. The ribbon system is Freud's stage theory rendered as costume. Each color a different psychic territory. Each transition a quiet developmental threshold. The girls study ballet and natural history. They learn about metamorphosis, caterpillars, butterflies, a snail, a deer. The teachers speak of monthly blood loss with clinical neutrality. BFI's Sight and Sound described the film as investigating the nature and socially conditioned origins of female sexual knowledge. A film that uses the iconography of Innocence to reveal the machinery operating beneath it. The coffin at the beginning is Freud's insight in a single image. The child arrives into this developmental stage as into an enclosure, with no memory of what came before and no knowledge of what waits outside. When the oldest girls finally leave through the underground passage, the film offers no reassurance. The world beyond the wall is simply the next stage, and the next stage has already begun. Peeping Tom, Michael Powell, 1960. Mark Lewis works as a focus puller at a London film studio. By night, he films women with a modified movie camera, a blade hidden in the tripod, a mirror attached to the lens. As he kills them, the mirror forces them to watch their own faces. He films everything. He watches the footage alone, afterwards, in the dark. When the film was released in 1960, British critics responded with something close to disgust. "Frankly beastly," wrote the Financial Times. "Wholly evil," wrote Nina Hibben. Powell, one of the most celebrated British directors of his generation, the man behind The Red Shoes and Black Narcissus, was finished overnight. The film was pulled from cinemas within days. Freud introduced the concept of scopophilia, the libidinal pleasure of looking, in his 1905 3 essays on the theory of sexuality. Looking, for Freud, is never innocent. The gaze carries desire, aggression. Scopophilia becomes pathological when looking replaces contact entirely, when the eye becomes the only instrument of relation to another person. Mark is a textbook case, but screenwriter Leo Marx built something more precise than a portrait of a killer. He built a trap. Mark's camera is the instrument of his scopophilia, but it is also, by extension, the cinema camera. The audience sitting in the dark, watching Mark watch his victims, is doing exactly what Mark does. The mirror on his camera is aimed ultimately at us. Every person who bought a ticket was implicated. The film didn't depict a voyeur. It created one. Mark's pathology originated in childhood. His father, a scientist who studied fear in children, used Mark as his primary subject, filming him constantly, flooding his room with lights at night, documenting his terror. Powell cast himself in the role of the father. His own son plays Mark as a child. The trauma of being perpetually watched transformed, in Freudian terms, into its opposite, the compulsion to watch. The passive became active. The victim became the camera. The critics who destroyed it in 1960, it turned out, had simply been the most honest audience it ever had. Cachet, Hidden, Michael Haneke, 2005. Georges Laurent Has a Perfect Life, a Paris townhouse, a literary television show, the kind of man who has arranged his existence so carefully that nothing uncomfortable can reach him. Then videotapes start appearing on his doorstep. Someone has been filming his house for hours, in silence, accompanied by drawings, a boy with blood coming from his mouth, a rooster with its head cut off. Georges knows exactly what these images mean, and he spends the entire film pretending he doesn't. This is where Freud becomes essential. Not the Freud of dreams and symbols, but the Freud of Nachträglichkeit, deferred action. The idea that a childhood event doesn't become traumatic when it happens, it becomes traumatic later, when something forces it back to the surface and retroactively charges it with a meaning it didn't have at the time. As a child, he told a lie. An Algerian orphan boy named Majid, about to be adopted by his family, was sent away instead. Majid's entire life was destroyed. But he was just a child. Children lie. It didn't matter, except it did. The threat feels external, but this is Freud's Unheimliche at its most precise, the familiar made threatening, the domestic made monstrous. The surveillance feels like it comes from outside because Georges has convinced himself the guilt belongs to someone else. Haneke never tells you who sent the tapes, because the question is wrong. The repressed doesn't need a sender. It generates its own return. Ordinary People, Robert Redford, 1980. Ordinary People won Academy Awards for Best Picture in 1980. It's filed away as a grief film. Nobody has read it as a Freudian case study. That's exactly what it is. Conrad Jarrett survived a boating accident that killed his older brother, Buck. He came home. He attempted suicide. He is now in therapy with Dr. Berger, trying to understand why he cannot simply continue living. The answer, in Freudian terms, is the superego. Freud described the superego as the internalized voice of parental authority, the part of the psyche that judges, condemns, and punishes. When it becomes tyrannical, it turns against the ego with guilt that has no rational basis, a verdict delivered before the trial even begins. Conrad's superego has issued exactly this verdict. You survived, your brother didn't. Therefore, you have no right to exist. The suicide attempt was the sentence. Every waking hour is an appeal the superego keeps rejecting. Beth, the mother, played by Mary Tyler Moore in a performance of terrifying restraint, is the external face of everything Conrad has internalized. She maintains the surface of a perfect life with a ferocity that has no room for grief, for a son who reminds her of what she lost. She has resolved her own psychic conflict by refusing to have one. And in doing so, she has become the living embodiment of the impossible standard Conrad's superego was built from. Dr. Berger's therapy works because it does the one thing the superego cannot tolerate. It insists that Conrad has the right to survive. Freud's most uncomfortable argument wasn't about sex. It was about civilization itself. In Civilization and its Discontents, he proposed that society functions only because individuals agree, consciously or not, to bury what they most deeply want and fear. The bargain is permanent, and the cost is never fully paid. These 7 films are what remains when the repression finally fails. Thank you for watching.